Okay, so without further ado, we'll come down here to module 7. So module 5 and 6 quiz is now, after class yesterday, available to you at the end of the day Sunday. You have to get that done. Don't forget that participation quiz from Monday's class is the one that requires that lockdown browser. I can see a lot of you still haven't done that, so please get on and get that done early, so we can make sure, everyone should be submitting this quiz. That way we know that the exam next week, we're not going to have any problems with a lockdown browser. If you don't do this quiz, it's kind of on you if we run into technical difficulties next week, okay? The other quiz from yesterday is available as well. So I think I figured out why on Canvas. I moved them into the assignment categories after I published them. And so I think Canvas defaulted the grades on that participation quiz from yesterday and the module 5 and 6 quiz, defaulted the grades to 0. So if you're seeing zeros in the grade book, it's temporary. As soon as you complete those, it will replace that 0 with whatever score you get. So I apologize for the inconvenience. In the short term, you're going to see zeros and they're going to impact your grade there for those 2 assignments. As soon as you complete them, though, they'll kind of update to what your score is. I think moving forward, I'll make sure that I'm careful and have those moved before I publish them, so that it should just default the grades like they have been to missing in the grade book. Okay? Yes. Question?
Yeah, I just had a small doubt. So for the module that was due today, the module 7,
Yep.
so I see a grade of 0 for me. It says that it's graded, and when I open the assignment, on top hat there was nothing uploaded. So I mean, is
So
that
you
just for the attendance
you
or
completed it. So module 7 reading, you completed on Top Hat.
yeah? I mean, when I opened it, it said that there's nothing posted on top hat.
Thought I saw. Let me see here. I can double check on this here. Okay, I have to log in. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. So it should be, yeah, it's switched over to review now because the due date has passed. Um,
Yeah, but I accessed it about 1.5 hour before.
okay, I can't really do this here, so let me take a look at this here real quick. So I can look at yours specifically. It looks like it's working for most people in here. I think it might be specific problem to you. So this is something that maybe we can talk about after class, kind of that 30 minutes of office hours after class. I think it might be an issue with your account. So we can talk about that later, okay?
All right. Yeah.
Okay?
Yep. Thank you.
Yep. Let me make sure that this is exited out so no one can see this here. All right. Okay, so that module, where was I leaving off? The module 7 reading, which was due before we started class today. That module 8 reading will be due before we start class, not tomorrow, but Friday, right, July 11th. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of assignments. I'll have that participation quiz. We'll kind of go through that later on in today's class. So that should now pop up under module 7 once we get there later on today as well, okay? Any other logistic questions before we jump into material here? Because we got a lot to cover here the next 2 days. Okay. Okay. So module 7 slides. Unlike some previous modules, I had skeleton complete. I just put up the complete version for this module. We'll kind of go through these together so you have everything that you need right there. We will then jump into it. So we talked the last couple days about market failures because of government actions, right? So taxes, price ceilings, etc. Now we're going to talk about other market failures that can exist, not from government actions, and then we're going to combine that and say, how could government actions solve some of these other market failures? Okay. So the term that we're going to use to kind of define these market failures are externalities, right? So all an externality is, it's an additional cost or benefit to somebody who isn't a producer or consumer. So when we're looking at a market and we're talking about producer consumer surplus, those are people who are either selling that product or buying that product, right? An externality is going to, and the demand curve told us marginal benefit to the consumers, supply curve told us marginal cost of the producers. So externalities are going to be costs or benefits to someone other than the producers and consumers. So some examples, like a positive production externality, right? So we really have 4 different types of externalities we'll talk about. So this would be something that when it's produced, it provides a benefit to people who aren't even involved in the production or consumption of that good, right? So, a kind of some cheesy ones, but right, even if you don't buy anything from a bakery and you're walking by on your way to work, you're not a producer, you're not a consumer, but you enjoy the smell of that fresh baked bread, right? Or probably a better one, beekeepers. Even if you don't like honey, you never consume it, you also don't produce honey, you're not a beekeeper. Well, what do bees do? They pollinate. So who is getting a positive production externality when we are seeing honey being produced, or these beekeepers? Well, the nearby orchards are going to have a positive or an additional benefit from that, right? They're not even involved in the honey market, but the fact that someone else is producing honey, those bees improve their, I don't know, their crop yield, or however you want to define that. I always think about other positive kind of production externalities. So this would be something like, I don't know, even if you're not involved in the market, like let's say the town is putting up like local garden centers, even if you don't use those gardens, you're not consuming them, you're not a producer, the fact that someone is building those, the scenery is nicer, right? So there's some additional benefit to you when you're driving through your town. A negative production externality, probably a little bit more common, and a lot more examples of this, is going to be when there's an additional cost from the production. So the easiest one here is pollution, right? All these huge factories, when they're producing cars and or whatever else they're making, they're putting out a lot of smog into the air. They have some byproducts, right, that end up in the drinking water. The production of all of those goods, these large production facilities, they're causing pollution, which is incurring additional cost to the people in the surrounding area. Okay. Excuse me. I can think of, if you live near one of them as well, you could think of the production, if it's a very loud process, noise pollution, right? The additional noise that's created by the production of certain goods would be a negative externality. So those are our production externalities, additional costs and benefits. We also have additional costs and benefits from consumption of goods. So a positive consumption externality would be that when someone consumes this, there's an additional benefit to other people. So I always think the best one, or the one that makes most sense to me, is education, right? Even if I don't get a college degree, the fact that other people, right, there's universities producing or supplying space to get this college degree, there's students getting this college degree, they then go out, create these new products, come up with things that better everybody's life. And so even if I don't get a college degree, I'm not a producer or consumer, I have an additional benefit from you getting a college degree. Another one, this is maybe a little bit more controversial, but if you look at the science, immunizations, right? Those only really work if everybody's getting immunized, right? So the fact that other people are getting immunized from certain diseases, you don't even have to get the immunization, right? You don't have to be a consumer of it, and you benefit from someone else getting it because now when you come into contact with them, they're not going to have the disease, right? So those would be positive consumption externalities. Benefits existing to people because people are consuming these goods. Another one would be a negative consumption externality. I think about, this time of year, July 4th, right? Other people consuming, right, using fireworks, right, provides an additional cost to me, even if I don't buy, like I didn't buy fireworks, right? I have a 7-month-old kid who's trying to sleep at night, right? And so I'm not a consumer or producer of fireworks, but the fact that my neighbors were consuming fireworks caused a huge negative externality in my life. Or you can think about smoking, right? If you're not a consumer of smoke, cigarettes, the fact that people are smoking cigarettes as you're walking by, you kind of have that smoke in your face. It's an additional cost to you, even though you're not consuming it. So here's our 4 different kind of categories. And really what we'll kind of break these down to really focus on is just, is it a positive or negative externality? And then that's going to have some implications when we look at the market for certain goods. So we're looking about a negative externality, right? So let's think about, we have our demand curve. This is going to be the consumer's marginal benefit. So we'll kind of specify this a little bit more now. The demand curve tells us the private marginal benefits, right? Or the marginal benefits to the buyers of that good. Supply tells us about the private costs or the cost, marginal cost to the sellers of that good. So we have our old equilibrium and our price and quantity, right? This is kind of what we've already set up, right? So this was the price and quantity that maximized total surplus for people in this market. If I have an electric vehicle, I'm not a consumer or a producer of, gasoline. I still might have an additional cost or benefit from the fact that other people use gasoline because of the pollution that it creates. Okay. So before we were just talking about the old equilibrium that we've been discussing. It maximized the total surplus for people in this market. Okay. What if there's an additional cost to people that aren't involved? So this is my example of people who have an electric vehicle. They're not using gasoline in their cars. They're not a producer or a consumer. However, the additional pollution that it creates causes them to have a cost, right? The air that they breathe is not as good. And so we could kind of put a dollar value to that. So let's say the cost to society of every single gallon of gas used, we can put a valuation of $1 to it. Well, what that means is at every quantity, the total cost to society will be whatever the costs were to the producers, that's represented by our supply curve, plus that additional dollar cost to other people not in this market. So we can think about our social costs, our marginal social cost. It's kind of like almost like society's supply curve, right? It tells us society's marginal costs. That will be whatever the producer's marginal cost was, plus this additional cost, external cost, or this additional negative externality. Okay. All right. So with this idea in mind, we now have the original supply curve. We also have society's marginal cost curve. It looks like a decrease in supply, but supply hasn't changed. This is just representing what the costs to society are. Okay. So society, where would society's marginal cost be equal to its marginal benefits? Well, that wouldn't be where the supply curve hits demand. That would be where society's supply curve, or where the marginal social cost the marginal cost to society is equal to the marginal benefit. So you can see here, society would actually want the equilibrium quantity of this good to be 20. That would be the point that maximizes total surplus, not for the market, but for all of society. Okay? So you can think about at any quantity below 20, what's true about the marginal benefits to society relative to the marginal cost to society? Well, the marginal benefits are higher for every unit here up until this last point, right? That's where we would say society is indifferent because their marginal costs are equal to the marginal benefits represented by the demand curve. So for every unit past 20, for society, what's happening? Well, there the marginal benefits are less than the marginal cost of society. So every unit between 20 and 25 here, and we know if the market decides, the market gets to the equilibrium where supply is equal to demand. They ignore the additional, right? Companies don't care about the additional cost to people other than them, and so they make decisions based off of their own costs. We end up at this equilibrium quantity of 25. For every unit in between 20 and 25, the cost to society is greater than the marginal benefit. So every unit here, we would actually have a negative kind of net benefit to society, or this is going to end up being our deadweight loss. Okay, so it looks a little bit different than when we were talking about deadweight loss with government actions, right? It's going to be not a triangle kind of on the inside here, but a triangle on the outside. Kind of almost looks more like subsidies, deadweight loss here, right? And it's because the market is producing past that optimal quantity for society. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? And I'll draw this out in a slightly different way. I kind of like to introduce it here with a slide. So we've got the market equilibrium is 25. We would say the socially optimal or the social equilibrium would be at a quantity of 20. Okay. So I'll try to give you a little bit more of an analysis, and I've got it in the slides, but I will do it on the dot cam as well here, since it's the first time we're kind of looking at it. So if I've got a market, and I'll start to use some notation that I think also will kind of help a little bit. So here was like the marginal benefits to the consumers. Here's my marginal cost to the producers. The old equilibrium price and quantity were right here. Okay. When we have this additional cost to society, so this negative externality, we said at every quantity, the cost will be whatever the producer's cost was, plus this additional amount. So I'll typically write this as MSC, or the marginal social cost. That'll be equal to the supplier's marginal cost plus whatever the value of that negative externality is. So when society is making the decision, here, if there's no positive externalities, the marginal social benefit is the exact same thing as the private marginal benefits. So society is going to choose the socially optimal quantity where their marginal benefits are equal to their marginal costs. So the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost, excuse me, at we'll kind of say S here for the quantity that society would want. Okay. So that doesn't match up with what the market gets to, right? So got this in the slides, but I think I can do this as well. So let's think about I showed you where deadweight loss was, but why? Okay. Well, let's think about where all of the surplus is in this market. So consumer surplus is the area above price, but below my demand curve. So here is my consumer surplus. Where is producer surplus? The area below the price, but above the supply curve. We've got producer surplus here. This should be the point that maximizes surplus for all of society. So if the market gets out here, it should be that total surplus is actually going to be lower for society. So let's think about why. Oh, I'll use green. What is the total cost to society in terms of the negative externalities? So these externalities, when we're looking at the value, that's like the externality on every single unit. So kind of our total cost to society is going to be whatever that external cost is on every unit times the number of units the market stops at. So this would really look like the area of a rectangle. So it's not quite a rectangle. It's actually going to be a parallelogram, but you would find the area the same way. Think about where would this total cost be on our graph? Well, for every unit, what's the value of that external cost? Just the difference between our marginal social cost and the supply curve. That difference represented the external costs all the way out to the quantity the market stops at. So notice this parallelogram, that would represent that total cost to society. So what is the total surplus for everybody in this society? Well, we would have consumer surplus, producer surplus, but part of that gets canceled out by this additional cost. So it's almost like this is really the total surplus to society if we were to stop at that socially efficient quantity, right? Because this area here, although it was producer and some consumer surplus, it was washed out or canceled out by this additional cost to society. So really all we had for total surplus at that socially efficient quantity was this. Now, if we go past that quantity, like we allow the market to continue to increase the quantity, we have some gain to producers and consumers that's canceled out by this additional cost. But then we have this area here, which is an additional cost, and there's no additional consumer producer surplus to cancel it out. So this little triangle here is why that represented the deadweight loss, right? Or we can think about it in a slightly different way. For every unit that the market overproduces by, what is the loss to society? Well, the net benefit to society would be the difference between their social benefits and social costs. What's true about every quantity here? The marginal social cost is greater than the marginal social benefit. So for every unit here, the difference between those two would represent the loss to society. Okay. Any questions on that? And I've got some animations on the slides that'll walk through this in a similar way, since I know these colors can kind of bleed together. So let's say I had a negative externality depicted. Right? We said here is total surplus, right? Or the difference between the marginal social benefit, because there's no positive externalities, and the marginal social cost for every unit up to the point where they're equal. So the kind of quantity that the society would want would be right here at 40. Okay. We can kind of think about, well, if we allow the market to make the decision, they'll choose where supply is equal to demand. They don't take into consideration society's additional costs. And so our equilibrium price would actually be down here at 45. Here's our consumer surplus, area above price below demand, producer surplus, area below price but above supply. Excuse me. And then if we think about marginal social costs for every unit here, here's the additional cost to society. So this surplus, right, negates, is negated by the additional cost to society. And then for every one of these additional units past the quantity of 40 up to the point the market gets to, which is what, like 55? The difference between our marginal social benefits and our marginal social costs, those would be additional costs that aren't offset by any, producer or consumer surplus. So this is going to represent, if we allow the market to get to this higher quantity, here's our deadweight loss. Okay. Any questions on anything there before we keep moving? Okay. Oh, I had another animation. So deadweight loss there, right? So the market overproduces from the socially optimal point, and we have a resulting deadweight loss. Okay. What about positive externalities? Okay, so a positive externality means that there's some private marginal benefit to the buyers or the consumers, but there's also an additional benefit to people outside of the market. So if there's an additional benefit, how are we going to depict that in our graph? Well, oops, skipping ahead a little bit here. But at every quantity, here's our private marginal benefits represented by the demand curve. Society's marginal benefits are going to be a little bit higher. Okay, so kind of go back here. I've got some of the statements about this, but I think I'll draw this out and then be able to point some of this stuff out along the way, and then we'll kind of summarize it going back to the slides. So let's say I've got a market. And if we're just looking at private marginal costs and the private marginal benefits, that market would get to this equilibrium. Okay. If we have an additional cost, right, try to keep my colors consistent, then, or sorry, if we have an additional benefit, we already did cost. Additional benefit at every quantity, there's an additional benefit. So the difference between society's marginal benefits and the private marginal benefits, this difference is just whatever the value of that positive externality is, or the external benefit. Okay. So we can kind of think about here, where is the socially optimal quantity? Well, where does society's marginal social benefits, and if there's no negative externalities, the private marginal cost would just represent society's total cost. There's no negative externalities here. So the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit right here. If there's something with a positive externality, society wants more of it. So this is kind of intuitive. When we had negative externalities, we said society actually wants less than what the market arrives at. With a positive externality, society actually wants more than where the market arrives at. Okay. So for society, if the market stops at this quantity, what is the loss of surplus, right? Well, basically, for every unit in this range, what's the difference between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost? If the market stops here, there is a bunch of unrealized surplus that could be gained if we were to be out here at the socially efficient quantity. So we have deadweight loss no matter if we have a positive or negative externality if we allow the market to decide the equilibrium. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Okay. So when we're looking at quantities, that are lower than the socially efficient quantity, then that's showing us that there's units where that marginal social benefit is above the cost. So if we don't get all the way out to that higher socially efficient quantity, there's going to be some units that would have had positive net positive surplus for society that we're not seeing produced and consumed in the market. Okay. If we go to higher quantities, kind of like we did with negative externalities, or higher, quantities that are higher than the socially optimal point, well, there we had that the marginal benefits were below the marginal cost, and we had some additional costs aside. So deadweight loss is kind of coming from two different avenues, right? When we had negative externalities, the deadweight loss came from the fact that we were producing units that had negative net benefits to society. When we have positive externalities, skip ahead here, there we go. We said, well, the market actually stops at a lower quantity. Well, there, the deadweight loss comes from the fact that we aren't seeing certain units produced that would have had positive net benefits to society. Okay. So just kind of using my graph there, but we'll kind of go back. So if I had a graph here, how could I determine what the value of the positive externality is? All that is, and I kind of had it in what I drew, it's the difference between our demand curve, or the private marginal benefits, and our social benefits, our marginal social benefits. So at any quantity, if I look at that difference, so here it's what? 50 to 70, so 20. I could also look at the intercepts, 80 to 100, it's 20. So at any quantity, the difference between that private marginal benefits and society's marginal benefits, that difference is the external benefit, or the value of the positive externality on every single unit in that market. Okay. All right. And then I kind of already drew this out for us, but you can kind of, I think I stole this even from the textbook. You're looking at other resources. I always kind of call this like private marginal benefits. Some places will reference this as like the internal benefits to society, or sorry, internal benefits to people in that market. So the producers and consumers. I typically will always kind of call these the private marginal benefits and the private marginal costs. Okay. So I won't try to draw this out with all the colors again, but for a positive externality, what is the total benefit to society? Well, if we were to get to that quantity where the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit, that should be where total surplus for society is maximized. Okay. So what would total surplus be? The difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs, or this entire black triangle. Why is my mouse doing goofy things here? All right. If we allow the market to make the decision, well, what is consumer and producer surplus? Well, the market would arrive at this price and this lower quantity. Here's our consumer surplus. Here's our producer surplus. However, when the market stops at this quantity, there's still going to be an additional benefit to society, right? Every unit that's being produced and consumed in this market is generating some positive externality. Okay? The value of that positive externality is just the difference between our private and social benefits, marginal benefits, multiplied by the quantity that the market stops at, right? So that value of the external benefit on every unit times the number of units the market stops at, this red area would be like an additional benefit to society. However, the fact that the market stops here, right? What we're not realizing is that there's all of these units from what, 45 to about 70, where the marginal social benefits are still above the marginal social costs, right? And so this is going to represent surplus to society that we're missing out on, right? So notice when the market stops here, here's our total surplus. We said if we get to that socially efficient quantity, here's our total surplus. What's the difference between those two? This little triangle here of deadweight loss. Okay. Excuse me. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. Let me think. Where are we at on time? Yeah, we'll keep going here. Let me see where we're at. Yeah, I will. If we have time towards the end, I might draw out something else for you that kind of helps solidify why this is dead weight loss. But I think hopefully you can kind of see it's the fact that we're underproducing from that socially optimal point. Here's all of the surplus that society is missing out on, the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal social cost for each one of those units. All right, so we now have this idea. We know that we have positive externalities and negative externalities. They can come from either the production or consumption of a good. So I want to be clear. Anytime you have a negative externality, you depict the marginal social costs as being higher. Okay? Anytime you have a positive externality, so it looked like kind of the supply curve was shifting. It wasn't shifting, but right, we were drawing the marginal social costs parallel to the supply curve. Anytime you have positive externalities, those were additional benefits, we were always drawing those kind of like through the demand curve. Doesn't matter if they came from the production or consumption of a good, we would always model them as additional benefits or what looked like modeling it through the demand curve. Okay. So how can we get to these socially efficient quantities? Well, if we have negative or positive externalities, well, we have tools that we've already talked about. So with a negative externality, I can actually use a tax. Right? So if we think about why, if I had a negative externality, so we've got my private marginal costs, private marginal benefits. Here's the quantity that the market would stop at. Okay. And here's the equilibrium price. Okay. If there's a negative externality, the cost to society will be higher, right, than the cost to producers. So we want the quantity to be down here. What is one way I can shift this supply curve we talked about last couple days? Well, if I tax something, it's like a decrease in supply. So I could tax producers here, or technically I could tax consumers. We said that would also kind of lower the demand curve. I can push the market using that tax to this socially optimal point. Okay. So this is where a tax sometimes we thought about as like generating deadweight loss. Here it can actually eliminate some of that deadweight loss that existed to society, right? It costs deadweight loss to the consumers and producers in that market, but for society overall, we said if the market was out here, this was our deadweight loss. If I tax it to push it back to that socially efficient quantity, I've now eliminated that deadweight loss. Okay. So we can use taxes to correct these negative externalities. What's something else I could use with a negative externality? So if I want the quantity to be lower, what's something else I could do? Just set a quota, right? This is a little bit tricky here, but what is one other thing I could do? So if instead of just limiting quantity or imposing a tax, what's another tool that we had that would push the quantity to be lower? If I imposed a price floor, right, that pushed the quantity to be a little bit lower, right? Now, technically, I could also impose a price ceiling, and we're talking about effective price floors and ceilings, and that would also push me to this lower quantity. So I have a lot of tools to deal with negative externalities. I can impose price floors, price ceilings, quotas, or a tax. Any questions on that idea? So what would be the ideal tax? Well, how much do I want to shift this supply curve I want it to match up with society's marginal costs. So if I've got my supply curve and I've got society's marginal cost, or the marginal cost plus the negative externality value of the external cost, how can I get my supply curve to match up with society's? This tax needs to be the exact same value of that negative externality. Okay. We would call that, and I think I have it in the slides eventually, but we call it a Pigovian tax, right? It pushes us exactly to that quantity that is optimal for society. Okay. Oh, I don't want to do that yet. So I'll try to keep this over here in case people are still writing. So we don't have as many tools, but we also have ways that we can correct positive externalities, right? So if I've got private marginal costs, private marginal benefits from my demand curve, I'll use green here. And we said if there's positive externalities, right, the marginal social benefit is going to be higher. So what point, where's my black marker? Right here. So the market, where supply was equal to demand, arrived at this equilibrium price and quantity. Society wants it to be out here. Well, all these other tools we had decreased quantity. What's the only tool that we have that can increase the quantity or shift my demand curve? That would be, right? So how could I get my private marginal benefits to be the same as the social benefits? I would have to add a subsidy, shifting my demand curve out until it matches up with society's marginal benefits. So the only real tool we have with positive externalities was subsidies, right? It's the only thing that we talked about that encourages more or a higher quantity in the market. Okay. Any questions over anything there? We'll go back to the slides. Okay. So probably have already said a lot of these things. Let's get all this stuff off the screen. So the idea of these corrective taxes with negative externalities, like I said, this is a Pigovian tax. The ideal tax there is then that tax is exactly the same as that external cost or the negative externality. And then technically, it's not usually called this, but you can think about like a Pigovian subsidy. There, the subsidy would need to be the exact same value as whatever that external benefit or positive externality was in every unit. Okay, so nothing too crazy there. Now, I guess technically there are other solutions. So if you had a command and control economy where the government is making the production decisions, you could always limit quantity of goods that are causing negative externalities like pollution. Or you could also force companies to make more of something if you thought there was a positive externality. In most of modern day economies, we don't see this command and control. We have more market-based solutions, which are things like taxes, subsidies. We'll talk a little bit about tradable pollution permits. I think with the Coase theorem, I think we'll have enough time to get through that today. So we'll take a look at some of this as well, but I kind of already worked through taxes, subsidies, quotas, price ceilings, and price floors. So what we're really doing with these taxes and these subsidies is we're making people in the market internalize the costs and benefits to society, right? So by imposing a tax on the producers or consumers, we're making them like whatever the cost of society is, they're now making decisions as though they have that same cost. Or if we're giving them subsidies, they're now making decisions as though they have that additional benefit. Okay? So we kind of would call that, they're like internalizing, the market is internalizing these externalities. Okay? So we worked through these already. I kind of went a little bit out of order. I drew these in. We had the quota, subsidy tax. I even did price ceilings and price floors. Before we get to Coase's theorem, let's take a look at these questions. And I'll probably add some in that aren't even in the quiz, just to think about things you could be asked on the quiz or the exam. So I think I only have 2 questions here. So let's say I had this depiction. Before I even look at the question, I don't have anything labeled. What do I know? What type of externality must I have here? Well, we said I've got my downward sloping demand curve. one of these is going to be my upward sloping supply curve. And what must the other one be? We said we always model negative externalities as additional costs. So negative externalities, we said that at every quantity, the cost is whatever it is to producers plus some additional amount. At this quantity, cost is whatever it is to producers plus an additional amount. So this gray line should represent our marginal social costs, and the blue line would represent just our private marginal costs or the supply curve. So the point where supply would be equal to demand is out here at this quantity of 60. Society, where would their marginal benefits be equal to society's marginal cost? That would actually be at a quantity of 50. So we've got a negative externality here. We can actually determine the value by simply looking at the difference in between these two lines. So it looks like here is what, 35 and 50, so $15. I could also use the intercepts, right? 10 and 25, that difference is 15. So I've got not only an externality depicted here, but we know it's a negative externality since it's modeled through that supply curve, right? Excuse me. I know the value of that externality by looking at the difference between society and the private marginal costs. I can then also start to think about, okay, well, from that same graph, what is the value of deadweight loss? Well, we said when the market stops at this lower quantity of 50, sorry, we would want the market to stop at this lower quantity of 50. The market actually produces up to this point of 60. So every unit here between 50 and 60, the marginal benefits, right, depicted by the green line, relative to society's marginal cost, every unit here, the costs are higher than the benefits. This little triangle would represent a loss of surplus when the market produces past 50 up to this point of 60. So how do we find the area of a triangle? 1/2 times base times the height. So what is the height of this triangle always going to be? So let's think about, in fact, I wouldn't even have to give you a depiction of the graph. I could give you less information. So we think about, we've got marginal benefits here, marginal costs, no positive externalities. Excuse me. So we just had the private marginal costs or society's marginal costs. We said the marginal social costs are higher. So what's true? The market will stop at this quantity. Society wants the quantity to be down here. Every unit here, we said the difference between society's marginal costs and their marginal benefits, the costs are actually higher. So this would represent like negative surplus, or this is our deadweight loss to society. Notice, what is the height of that triangle always going to be? Well, what's the difference between our marginal social costs and our private marginal cost? That's just the value of that negative externality or the external cost. What's the width always going to be? It's how many units the market is overproducing by. So our deadweight loss, the area of that triangle, will always be how many units the market overproduces by times whatever the additional cost is per unit, and then it's a triangle, so always multiply that by 1/2. So if I simply told you the value of this negative externality is 15, that was what we got from the graph. And there, if I didn't give you the graph, but I told you that was the external cost, I then told you, the equilibrium quantity of the market is currently 60. Society's optimal point would be 50. I would actually have enough information to go ahead and find deadweight loss. But if I have a graph, kind of like in the question that we have here, I can grab the actual values, right? I don't have to be told the values. I can grab it from the graph here. So that'd be what? 55 and 40. So 15 times 10 times 1/2. So what? 75. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? So we have till 12:30. I think it's worthwhile. What if I did, just to kind of point this out, what if I had positive externalities and I was thinking about something like deadweight loss? So show you a slightly different way thinking about this. I said if we had time, I would, and I will have time here. So here's the quantity the market gets to. And if we have an additional benefit, my marginal social benefits out here, no additional costs now. So my private marginal costs are society's marginal costs. So society wants the quantity to be out here. Okay. So when the market stopped here, we said all of this represented like social economic surplus. And then we could kind of break this area down into consumer and I guess I keep colors different here, producer surplus. Okay. If we could somehow force the market, so let's think about like those command and control economies. If I could somehow force the market out to here, what ends up being true? We think about like where would I could think about like if I were to force the price to be down here, where would producer and consumer surplus be? I'm going to end up with the difference between supply and demand here. And kind of think about this. So here's our price. Here would be like a loss of consumer surplus. And here, because the price is actually below supply, this would represent kind of like, sorry, this would represent our loss of consumer surplus. Here would represent our loss of producer surplus because the price would be below the supply curve, so below marginal costs. So that would be like negative producer surplus. The price would be above consumer's marginal benefit. So this would be negative consumer surplus. However, when we force the market out to this quantity, what's the additional social surplus? It's this entire area. This kind of negates each other, and we're left with this additional benefit to society, which is why when we didn't produce up to this point, this was the surplus we're missing out on, or this would be our deadweight loss, this kind of red shaded area, right? And another way of thinking about it, I think the easier way, instead of getting too lost in this graph here, it's really from the underproduction of this good, there are units where the marginal social cost is below the marginal social benefit, so society is not getting these positive net benefits from those units. When I calculate this deadweight loss, notice with a positive externality, what's the height of this triangle always going to be? Well, what's the difference between society's marginal benefits and the private marginal benefits? Just that, I didn't leave myself enough room, but that external benefit or the value of the positive externality. So that will always be the height, right, of our triangle. What is the width of our triangle always going to be? Well, it's going to be how much or how many units the market is underproducing by. And then it's a triangle, so we would always have then multiply by 1/2. So, these areas on the graph, they do, they are what they are, but they represent, right, these different things, okay? They represent the external benefits. That's the height of my triangle. The number of units being underproduced, that's the width. And then because we have these linear supply and demand curves, we've got this triangle, we multiply it by 1/2. Okay. All right. Any questions on that before we switch gears a little bit here? So just 2 questions, right, on that quiz today. Once again, shouldn't be too bad. We'll then go back and talk about Coase's theorem. Maybe. There we go. So it's going to be kind of a weird, kind of seem like a dumb example, but I'll give you an additional one after we go through this. That maybe is a little more real world. But this one could be very real world. In fact, my neighbors will probably think that this is a real one. So Dick owns a dog named Spot, right? So this is like an old children's book. There's a negative externality from this dog, right? The dog barks a lot. Jane, the neighbor, doesn't like it. Right? So the socially efficient outcome is going to be what maximizes total welfare for both of these individuals. We just assume it's a 2 individual society here, just to make it easy. So if Dick values having the dog more than Jane values her peace and quiet, the dog should stay, right? Because there the benefit to Dick would be greater than the cost to Jane, and so we'd have like a net positive net benefit. Coase's theorem says the private market will always reach that socially efficient outcome. Okay, so kind of setting up that intuition. Let's think about case one. Let's assume instead that the benefit to Dick we put of having the dog Spot is $500. That's how much he's willing to pay to keep the dog. The cost to Jane, she hates the barking so much, she'd be willing to pay up to $800 to get rid of the dog. Okay. So what's the socially efficient outcome? Well, Spot's going to go, leave. So we can kind of think about why, because there's a range of values here, and I'll show you a depiction in a second. But let's assume Jane comes over to Dick and says, I'll give you $600 to get rid of the dog. Well, the benefit to owning the dog is $500. So if you give Dick $600, yeah, he loses the dog, but he gains $600. What's the kind of change in his marginal benefit? He's $100 better off. He's okay getting rid of the dog. Now, I'm a dog lover. My wife and I have two massive Great Pyrenees, and this example makes my skin crawl. But this is the idea, right? He'd be willing to get rid of the dog. Jane is okay paying $600 because once the dog is gone, her cost is no longer $800. It's only that $600 that she offered to get rid of the dog. She's better off. Right? So you can kind of think about when we have these examples. So it would be like, really, if Dick values owning this dog at $500, right? If I offered him any amount of money greater than his marginal benefit, right? He would be willing to accept that amount of money to get rid of the dog. Now, for Jane, her cost was $800, so she's willing to offer any amount less than that, because if she offers any amount less than that, her cost is actually lower than if the dog stays. So anytime you have kind of this overlap in the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of the two individuals, there's going to be a range of values where they can come to an agreement. Okay. And I chose, one specific number, which was 600 here. Okay. So go back to the slides here in a second. So, well, I can switch to easy enough. There we go. Oh, it's not what I wanted. There we go. We'll get there. There we go. So this was if Dick had the right to decide if Spot went, or like he has the right, right? Well, if he has the right, they could come to an agreement. If Jane has the right, well, there doesn't have to be any agreement made. She just says, I want the dog gone, right? So this is just kind of an example where even with the same valuations, it doesn't matter who has the right to make the decision. If we allow people to kind of barter back and forth, even the person who owns the dog, if they have the ultimate decision, there's an amount of money that they will both agree upon if these were in fact the marginal costs and marginal benefits. Now, the third case, let's assume that Dick has the right to keep Spot, right? If the value to Dick is 1,000 and the cost is to Jane is still 800, well, now is there any amount of money that Jane is willing to offer Dick to get rid of this dog? Well, if we do kind of the same sort of setup, now you would have to offer Dick something more than 1,000. Jane was only willing to offer something less than 800. Is there any overlap? Or is there any amount that both of them would be okay with? No. So what happens in this case? No agreement is made. And if Dick has the right to decide if the dog stays, the dog is going to stay. Right? So, and that in fact was the socially optimal decision, right? The additional benefits to this society of 1,000 were greater than the additional costs, so it should be that they stay. Now, if Jane had the right to get rid of the dog, well, what amount of money would Dick be willing to offer? Well, if he values the dog at 1,000, he'd really offer anything up to $1,000. So let's say they offered like 900. Well, there would he, would Oh, would Jane accept $900? Yes, right? That marginal benefit, she'd still have the cost of the dog barking of 800, but she'd be $100 better off. Dick, if the dog goes away, he loses a value of 1,000. So by paying 900, he's actually $100 better off. So there's actually still a range of values where they could come to an agreement and arrive at that socially efficient outcome. Okay. So why do these private solutions not always work, right? So it's kind of similar to what I set up with this transaction cost. I went through an example with taxes that are, it's really a similar kind of concept. So let's say I had an example and let's say somebody values a used car at $5,000, right? And they're selling the car, right? So they'd be willing to take any amount of money above 5,000. That's kind of their marginal benefit to owning the car. I could then think about, well, what if somebody wanted to buy that car, right? And they're willing to pay anything kind of less than 8,000, right? They valued 8,000. They're going to come to some agreement in the middle here. And this is like the idea, even if these were our values for Jane and Dick here, right? The problem is if there's some additional transaction costs, right? So let's say like 6,000 here, we would see an agreement made, right? This person's willing to sell the car, this person's willing to buy it. However, if we add some additional transaction costs that when a used car is sold, this is kind of a goofy example, but there's a $4,000 amount that has to be paid to the government, right? Or has to be paid, maybe this isn't buying a car, maybe this is like some type of legal thing and you have to pay lawyers, right? Well, there at that price of 6,000, what's the actual price? 10,000? That's no longer in kind of our range where they can come to an agreement. Now, if there's small transaction costs, maybe it still occurs, but if they're large enough, we may actually not see an agreement be made and we don't arrive at that socially efficient point. So back in our example here, when it was 8 and 500, oh, there we go. If for whatever reason Jane and Dick hate each other and they have to get lawyers involved, if the lawyers' costs get to be above $300, there's going to be no range where these two overlap. Okay? So, and I won't ask you a lot of questions about this, but just to kind of think about it more in the real world, what can stop Coase's theorem from working? Transaction costs. Right? And usually these are like lawyer fees. That's the easiest way to think about them. Stubbornness, maybe sometimes people are just stubborn and they want to get their own way. So what could that really be depicted as? Well, if we have stubbornness can really be modeled as I get an additional benefit from getting my way. And in the most extreme case, people that you know that like always have to like they just have to get their way all the time. Really, what is their marginal benefit from not making a deal? Infinite, right? If all I care about is always being right and getting my way, then there's really no amount of money you could offer me that'll ever be larger than my marginal benefit of getting my way, because the marginal benefit of getting my way is infinite. Right? There's no amount of money that could be made or could be offered. Right? So transaction costs, stubbornness, and then we won't really look at models like this, but these simple two-person models, it's easy to think about. They could come to an agreement. If you had hundreds of people, right, just the coordination of everybody's marginal costs, marginal benefits, it might be very difficult, or it might be very costly to get them all together and kind of agree. So outside of this class, you would actually start to dive into what we would call coordination problems, could sometimes force Coase's theorem to break down. Okay. So here's kind of a summary of what we talked about today with externalities, so positive and negative externalities. I've got a couple examples listed of each one. We've got the solutions. So I said tax, cap and trade. We didn't talk a ton about this. Or we didn't talk about this at all. We talked about quotas, price ceilings, and price floors could actually also be used to solve the negative externality problem. And then the only solution we had for positive externalities was to use subsidies. Okay. Well. So we've got 13 minutes. what do I want to do with the remaining part of class today? Because I know when we talk about types of goods, I think we will have enough discussion or enough time to discuss this. So I'll introduce what we're going to focus on more next class, which is public goods and common resources. Sorry, not natural resources, common resources. Um, so I think we're probably all familiar with public goods. So this is going to be things like a state park, right? I can go use that state park. I didn't pay for it to be there. It's free for me to go in and use. Now, some state parks there's fees, but I don't know. We could think of something like what's a local park? Bryant Park, I think. Or you can go use the kind of a local park. You weren't a producer, you weren't a consumer, right? Many people can use that good. We would call it a public good. National defense, right? This is something that we're not directly paying for, right? But we all get to enjoy the benefit of. And so public goods are going to present some problems, right? Because once they're made available, right, once national defense is paid for, I can't prevent people from enjoying the benefit of being protected by that national defense. Okay? So we're not really going to have market forces with these public goods, or we will, sorry, I shouldn't say that. The market forces won't dictate how much of these public goods we have. And what we'll see is that quite often with public goods, we end up at what would be socially inefficient quantities, or they experience kind of the negative externality problem and we don't get enough of them. The market stops at a quantity that's too low. In fact, quite often with public goods, let's use national defense as an example. And here we can kind of think about it. So there's a huge, so let's say, here's the marginal social benefit to having a national defense. Here's the marginal social cost. And this is, I don't know, some level of national defense, however you want to measure this, number of tanks, number of soldiers, etc. Well, this is the total benefit to society, right? But when we're thinking about if we let individuals make the decision, how much does each person benefit from that national defense? So the total benefit to society, it's kind of like it's every single person's demand curve added up, but any one individual's demand curve is going to be really small, right? Like, yes, I benefit from having a national defense, but the marginal benefit to me is not greater than the entire marginal social cost to providing national defense. So if we allow consumers to make the decision, is there any overlap in supply and demand? Well, no, right? If there's huge positive externalities that exist, quite possibly for these public goods, we see the market actually arrives at zero when the socially efficient quantity of national defense is much higher. Okay? So public goods, we quite often see that we don't get the socially optimal quantity. In fact, a lot of times we would have zero of those goods. Okay? So what makes things, or how would we define things as a public good? Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of different traits of goods and put them into 4 categories. So the first trait is going to be, is something excludable or non-excludable? Right? So an excludable good is going to be, I can prevent other people from receiving a marginal benefit when I consume that good. Right? Non-excludable is going to be, when I consume this good, I can't prevent other people from enjoying the benefit. So if I have internet service, well, I'm paying for it. I can prevent other people from using it because I have it set up with a password. Or if I go to buy a sandwich from Jimmy John's, I can make sure nobody else gets to eat that, right? It's excludable. Non-excludable is once that good is purchased, once it's out there, everyone gets to enjoy the benefit of it. So national defense is a really good example, right? Once we have a national, can I stop any American citizen from enjoying the benefit of having a national defense that protects our nation? No. Once that public park that's free to everyone is built, right, made available, can I prevent people from using it? No, right? Now, I guess technically I can if I make it a non-free public park, right? But if it's a free public park, it's non-excludable. Okay? I always think about this as like, I guess technically, what's a non-excludable good? So these lectures that I'm putting on YouTube, technically you consuming that video doesn't prevent other people from consuming that video as well. So like social media and YouTube, I always think about those as a good example also of a non-excludable good. Mhm. Now, if I only uploaded these videos and I, required, I don't know, if you're the first person that logs on that you can set a password, that would make it excludable. Kind of a goofy example there, but we can think about like the same type of good. We could kind of see its characteristic change depending on, if it's a park, how can I make it excludable? I can, put up gates and require an access code, something like that. Okay. The other characteristic we have for goods is going to be, is it rival or non-rival? So a rival good is once I consume or once this good is consumed, nobody else can consume it, right? So this example would be like a sandwich. Once I eat a sandwich, no one else can eat that same sandwich. Now they can eat the same type, but they can't eat that specific quantity, right? That specific unit of that sandwich. Another one that might be easier to think about, anytime you have like stadiums tickets, well, once you purchase a ticket to that seat, can anybody else purchase a ticket to that same seat? No, they're rival goods. Once you consume that good, no one else can consume that same, row 4, seat 5 ticket. Okay. Now, a non-rival good is going to be where me consuming it doesn't prevent other people from consuming it as well, right? So, this is going to be like, I put iTunes music. This is really old, like Spotify, something like that. It kind of is dating me using referencing iTunes here. I guess I don't know, it's still a thing, but I don't know. Everyone uses Spotify now. So if I go out and I guess we don't have to really purchase songs anymore, but you could have to purchase the rights. Let's say, think of a good example. UFC. I occasionally watch some of the UFC fights and their pay-per-views, right? I have to go out and pay for it. It's an excludable good, but it's non-rival because when I pay to watch that pay-per-view, other people can also purchase that same pay-per-view event. Right? So a non-rival good, when I purchase that good, it doesn't prevent other people from enjoying the marginal benefit or purchasing that same good. When I purchase a baseball ticket to row 3, seat 5, no one can purchase a baseball ticket for that game for row, what did I say, 3, seat 5, right? So those are our two traits, excludable, non-excludable, right? So generally we think about excludable. What makes something excludable is it has a price, right? You have to pay for it. Non-excludable, you can just use it. It's free, right? Once it's out there, everyone can enjoy the benefit of it, right? You don't have to pay for it. Rival, non-rival, we think about this as like, it's rival if once I use it, no one else can, okay? So we're gonna have 4 different types of goods, right? And the combination of these different traits. So our typical goods we usually think about, we'll call these private goods. This is gonna be cars, personal computers, right? When I go out and buy my car, no one else can buy that same car. It's rival. And I say the same car, they can buy the same brand and, but they can't buy my car, right? It's excludable in that, well, I can only drive that car if I purchase it, right? So these are typical goods. Most goods are going to be private goods. Our public goods, which I kind of already alluded to, like national defense or like a lighthouse that's put out on on a lake, like on Lake Michigan. Well, it's non-excludable. Once it's out there and once it's shining, anyone can use it. They don't have to pay to use it. It's there, right? I can use the light. It's free essentially. So non-excludable, if it's easier to think about, it's almost like it's free. Or sorry, yeah, non-excludable is free. Non-rival is also a trait of public goods because me using the lighthouse doesn't prevent other people from also using that same light coming from the lighthouse. So non-rival, non-excludable, those are going to be our public goods. And then the other two types we have, an excludable good that's non-rival. So an excludable good, right, that's something I have to pay for. So think of something like cable internet or, I don't know, internet service in general. I can't use AT&T internet unless I pay for the service to be installed in my house, so it's excludable. However, it's non-rival in that me paying for access to AT&T internet doesn't prevent my neighbor from also purchasing it, right? So me consuming it doesn't. Now, that might not be the best example because like maybe, if it's on the same thing, the bandwidth, it makes it, a little bit busier. But the idea there being me and my neighbor can both, it doesn't, if one of us pays for AT&T internet, the other person can also pay for it as well. We can use it at the same time, enjoy marginal benefits at the same time of that same good. Okay. So we're going to call those natural monopoly goods. And quite often, once we start talking about monopolies in a future module, we see the examples of natural monopolies, like in one area, there's usually only one electric company, right? Or there's one internet provider, right? One trash service, etc. So non-excludable and rival, those are going to be common resources. So something that's non-excludable, I always use like fish in the ocean, kind of as an example. Like I could go out in the ocean and fish, right? It's non-excludable. It's free for me to go out and fish, or any lake. However, it's rival in that once I catch a fish and I keep it, no one else can catch that same exact fish, right? So common resources we think about are non-excludable, but rival. So a couple minutes left. I think we'll revisit this. I'll give you an example and kind of show you how the same good having different characteristics could actually be classified as different types of goods: private goods, common resources, or public goods. So I gave you some examples here today. We'll kind of think about the same good and how different characteristics of that good could change whether or not it's a common resource or a public good, etc. Okay. And then we'll talk about public goods and common resources a little bit more in depth, relate that to what we talked about today with positive and negative externalities. And that should kind of round us out for module 7 here. So just a reminder before I stop the recording, we had that participation quiz for today. That'll be due by the end of the day Sunday. So that's sitting under the module 7 category on Canvas. That module 8 reading is available and due before we meet in class on Friday. We'll finish module 7 tomorrow, start module 8 on Friday. Okay. Any other questions for me before we stop this recording related to content? Okay. I will see you guys tomorrow.